Kia ora. Welcome to our Zoom live streamed extraordinarily wonderful panel tonight called Young People These Days. My name is Chlöe Swarbrick. I am a Green Party MP based in Auckland Central, and I also happen to be one of those young people these days. We have a wonderful lineup of incredible and inspiring, particularly inspiring to myself, which is why I was so fortunate as to ask them to come on board, and they all said yes tonight, who will all be talking about a number of the challenges that have been facing younger people prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, but particularly as we look to rebuild and reset the so-called economy and what all of that actually means, particularly in the context of the intergenerational crises of inequality and climate change. I am letting you all know that you can place any form of feedback or any form of questions that you have. We do have a pretty tight time frame for tonight of about an hour, but if anything comes to mind throughout this kōrero, if you pop it into the chat, if you are on Zoom, or if you put them into the comments on the Facebook Live, then we have an amazing team behind the scenes here within the Green Party offices who will be feeding that back through to myself, and I will put those questions through to our panelists tonight. I think that it's really pertinent that we are having this discussion as not only talking about the challenges that are being faced, but particularly the kind of rhetoric that we're hearing from some interesting politicians across the political aisle who regularly will invoke rhetoric such like, future generations are going to have to bear the debt that is required in order to build up the requisite jobs and infrastructure required for us to heal from the wounds of COVID-19. But also that younger people have been those rangatahi at the forefront of movements such as Black Lives Matter. They are the ones who have been organising, particularly here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, the solidarity movements to show how we very much recognise that racism is a problem here at home, but also in solidarity with those over in the United States. Also, obviously, there has been a huge amount of leadership from rangatahi within their whānau, within their communities and across the country, with the likes of movements such as School Strike for Climate, and movements like Generation Zero, which helped to put the zero carbon bill firstly on the agenda, pushing forward the conversation to enable us as the Greens to pass the Zero Carbon Act unanimously, spearheaded by our co-leader, James Shaw, as Minister for Climate Change. But hey, look, there is a lot of things that we are going to be talking about and unpacking tonight. So without further ado, the politician will shut up, and I'll actually introduce another local body politician to you. This person is a massive inspiration to me. I actually met her for the first time at a union meeting about a year and a half ago. She'll correct me anyway. And I happened to be going to the airport thereafter, and she hitched a ride with me. And we had a conversation where she was talking about being from Taranaki and the challenges facing the community, particularly the mahi that she did in volunteering on environmental causes. And I really backed her to run for Taranaki Regional Council. And it is my pleasure to introduce the relatively recently elected councillor, Alvisa Vanderleiden, who is a Taranaki Regional Councillor. Alvisa, I'll hand it over to you to introduce yourself. I'm sorry for potentially stealing some of the things that you would speak to, but kia ora iho. You're on mute, my friend.
Of course.
There you are.
Of course. Someone had to do it first. Yeah, thanks. I was just saying, thank you for inviting me along to have this kōrero with you. It's an honour, and the inspired nature of our friendship is mutual. So thank you so much. Kia ora koutou. My name is Alvisa, and as mentioned, I was elected to Taranaki Regional Council last year. It was actually last year that we met at the PSA Youth Hui. So a lot has happened between October last year and now.
Not only a pandemic, you also got elected.
A lot, yeah, more than a lot, underestimated. So yeah, just a bit of background about where I'm from. I grew up in Tokoroa in the South Waikato and travelled around the North Island before settling here in Taranaki. I've got a background in media studies and marine science, which have come together very nicely as I now contract here in Taranaki as an environmental educator, project coordinator, and sometimes I help out with the Department of Conservation, both volunteering and as a casual. I decided to stand for regional council, obviously, when I attended this youth hui in Wellington with Chlöe being the keynote speaker. And I met so many inspiring and passionate young people who are doing so many amazing things for various causes. One of the people that we listened to was Laura from Action Station, and that was a big eye-opener as well, so shout out to Action Station. I also want to give a shout out to Asher Wilson Goldman from the Kapiti Coast, who did a workshop on local government at this hui, and that actually initially sparked my curiosity to learn more about how young people can get involved in governance. And advice she would have for a young environmentalist thinking about standing for council in an oil and gas region. And now here we are. So obviously there's something going on in a region, a lot of changes happening. Yeah, so that's kind of where we're at the moment. And a couple of things that are most important to me at the moment is number one, climate change, and penguins, which ties into climate change as well, which I can elaborate on later on.
Penguins, I will write that down. Yeah, you also went and showed me some penguins in Taranaki, and that was one of the coolest things ever. I mean, I'm a big fan of dogs, but I think penguins might be pretty close up there as among my favourite animals. Thank you so much, Alvisa. Our next panellist tonight is another massive inspiration here. We basically just have this circle of people who I think are ridiculously cool. So, such is the case when you get to host one of these kinds of things and also have an incredible green team behind you. She first came onto my radar a little while ago when she very validly critiqued the fact that the school strike mainstream movement wasn't taking into account the perspectives and needs of the Pacifica community, and particularly Pacifica Rangatahi, and the overlap of the planned strike with Pacifica, the festival. And subsequent to that, she has consistently been an incredible stalwart for the stalwart is a word that typically is bandied about for people who are much older than her. But she is somebody who has consistently held the line on some issues that seem somewhat controversial in Aotearoa, that being the reality that racism exists here and we need to confront that. She has brought that mahi into her role as the head girl of Aorere College, and also as the founder of For the Culture, which is a kind of frontlines movement of South Auckland youth, particularly Pacifica youth, who have been doing some incredible things in the climate movement. It's my honour to introduce Fili Fepulea'i Fepulea'i. Kia ora, ihoa.
Lava, thank you so much. I'm so blessed and so grateful to be here tonight. So yeah, my name is Fili. I go by Fili. I'm 17 years old, born and raised in Mangere, South Auckland. I hail from the villages of Fepulea'i and Sahunga in Savai'i, Samoa. And yeah, like I said, I'm really blessed to be in this space right now. So thank you guys for letting me be here. So a lot of the work that I do as a head girl or as someone who likes to serve my community is do 40K, which is For the Culture. We're primarily an environmentalist group, really grassroots, like our meetings are in the McDonald's, like we really do. We really started really small, and I like to think that it's such a humbling thing for us to be able to do that. And a lot of the work that we do is around bringing Indigenous voice into the climate change space, into, you know, advocating for our islands as Pacifica youth, and working with other Indigenous NGOs and Indigenous corporations as well. So yeah, and also a lot of the other work I do is around art advocacy. As a spoken word poet, you know, it's important to make these things accessible to not only those in the academic spaces, but all parts of society, which is something I'm really passionate about. One of the most important things to me right now as a student who is watching the effects of COVID-19 in my community, coming from a low socioeconomic community, it's really important to keep the mental health of our youth strong, and letting them know that we are there for them and that they're important, and that every story, no matter what the intersection is important and matters, especially in such a crucial time. So I think that's probably one of the most important things to me at the moment, along with continuing the fight against climate change. So yeah, that's me.
Tautoko, thank you so much, Fili. I'm so stoked to have you on board tonight, as well as you, Alvisa. So coming up now, our third and definitely not final, or the least rather, however that terminology goes, is another incredible young wahine. We actually happen to have all wahine on the panel tonight, which is kind of cool. That's probably somewhat indicative of the future. I don't know. You make up your own mind. And this is somebody who I first met, I think properly, although we'd bumped into each other and crossed paths at a number of different kind of youth engaged in politics, kind of climate issues. But this is somebody who has been leading another somewhat controversial campaign, at least if Mike Hosking has anything to say about it. And that is to lower the voting age to enable those who have a disproportionate effect, are disproportionately impacted or affected by the future to come, by the decisions that are being made today. And that is Gina Dao-McLay, who is the co-founder or the founder of Make It 16 Aotearoa New Zealand. I'll hand it over to you, Gina, and you can clarify any of those things.
Yeah, awesome. Super grateful to be here. Kia ora, my name's Gina Dao-McLay. I'm 17 and I've been born and raised here in Wellington, to a Pākehā father and then a first-generation immigrant Vietnamese mother. So I'm the co-director of Make It 16. Didn't quite found it. And yeah, joined about, I'd say 10 or 11 months ago. And yeah, have been loving it ever since. So as Chlöe explained, we are a campaign to lower the voting age to 16 here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. You know, we believe that voting is a fundamental human right. And particularly with this upcoming election, there are, you know, so many issues going on in the world, and you know, we would love to see 16 and 17-year-olds having our voices heard, just the same as everyone else who's eligible to vote too. So yeah, that's kind of the mahi that I work on.
Mayonnaise. And Gina, you, I think, also have answered some incredible questions in the past. And I remember being at the launch of the Make It 16 campaign this time around, this term in Parliament, when I had the good fortune of hosting your incredible lineup of spoken words, slam poets, and young people who spoke to how their say in democracy can't just be held from kind of outside the fort, the ivory tower of Parliament. This kind of all, I think, each single one of you have spoken to different ways of making space in politics and in decision-making capacities. And Fili, I find it really funny talking to, you know, your experience of meeting in Macca's, because I had that same experience when I went down south to Manurewa and met with Sarah Colcord, who was a local board member for a while there, now doing some incredible work with small businesses in Aotearoa. And that to me was a great kind of earth-shattering experience as this kind of Palangi Pākehā kid, going down south, having been from Central, previously having exposure to like meetings in cafes or like these hubs or hotspots that are spaces made for this kind of kōrero, but it doesn't necessarily exist in all spaces. And I think, Alvisa, you kind of touched on it too, with regard to how, you know, you are now a councillor in an oil and gas hub and hotspot. How do you have these conversations about climate? So I'll kind of throw that open to all of you around making space and around breaking down these norms and stereotypes, and how you open those conversations, and people might not necessarily expect it to come either from your perspective or your voice or from your community. So Alvisa, to you.
Yeah, so back to penguins. I attended the International Penguin Conference representing our local penguin monitoring project, Finding Little Blue. That was a Curious Minds project where we worked with intermediate age kids at local intermediate schools and they learnt about the ecology of penguins, biology of penguins. We watched a lot of penguin videos, and then we used technology to monitor man-made penguin burrows so that we can start, there's been a huge data gap in the Taranaki region in terms of like penguin data compared to, say, the South Island, where they've monitored tauki and hoiho for many years, and are starting to see massive effects from whether it's overfishing or climate change. And one of the things that I noticed has a huge impact on people who don't have an ecology background. When people don't understand a concept, they either reject it, or they're just kind of like in the middle ground, sitting on the fence, because they don't want to commit to something they don't quite understand. So if you use something like penguins to highlight how they're an indicator species, they use space, and they take up space in the marine environment and on land, which means that we can monitor them from land, and the conditions of their populations can tell us what the marine environment might be saying, or like what's going on in the marine environment. So penguins are an indicator species. And at the International Penguin Conference last year, one of the first things they said to us was, if you study penguins, you are by default a climate change scientist. Because there was a huge, with hoiho, for instance, which won Bird of the Year last year, big campaign. They predict that the hoiho will be extinct on the mainland of New Zealand within the next 15 to 20 years. And one of the things that indicates that they are struggling is, for instance, they put video cameras on the back of hoiho to see what they're eating out in the environment, in the marine environment, see what they're catching. And the biodiversity in those marine environments that they're used to catching their food has changed rapidly in a very, very short period of time. If we think about fish species that normally hang out near the coast in a sort of warmer environment, certain species can only handle a very small temperature sort of spectrum. And so if the water temperature rises even just 1 or 2 degrees, they will either die, or they will go and find water that they can adjust to. That it's like you can't expect them to evolve in such a short period of time to handle those temperatures. So they'll move away from where they normally inhabit. So penguins, when they go out to look for food and their food's not there, they burn more energy trying to look for their food than they are actually consuming energy. So they lose weight very fast. And a few years ago, we found that with the little blue penguin, or korora, in the North Island along the east coast, there was a mass die-off. And a lot of that was to do with the turbulence of the water from all the storms, but also the lack of food. A lot of fledglings that weren't strong enough yet to find their food, they were dying of starvation. And they could tell at the universities from the necropsies, just by looking at their chest bone. If they were sticking out, you could tell that they didn't have strong muscles covering those chest bones, and they were starving. So that's just one example of how we can find out what's happening out in the ocean. Penguins.
And that also offers a great insight for folks who may see it as a really complicated issue to tackle otherwise. And it's kind of that metaphor, but also a very tangible reality for those species, particularly our native species. But that brings me to a question actually for Fili, which is about the perspective that you bring, particularly with regard to 40K and trying to progress the kōrero and the elevation of the perspective of Indigenous cultures, particularly in the climate change space. What has been the reception, and how have you continued to fight that fight when there has been those elements of pushback? Because there has got to be a lot of resilience in the community that you have built around you, speaking to the mental health kōrero as well.
Yeah, definitely. I feel that for climate change, and actually all political issues, people tend to forget that there are people who are actually hurting from these issues and who are facing very real, very tangible impacts, even if we can't see them ourselves. And so something that was really important was during around the time where the school strike for climates were really on a roll, for the culture kind of realized that there weren't enough Indigenous voices and there weren't enough brown voices that are being lit to make the decisions around, climate change discussions. And that was very troubling for us because the Pacific Islands emit less than 1% of all world carbon emissions, but we're on track to being some of the first countries that will sink over the next 30 years, which is very scary and actually very terrifying when I think about it, thinking that my own island could be gone before I am. And when I think about it like that, it becomes more of a necessity that we open up space and that we are the ones to push back and to speak up and kick our thoughts through the door and say, actually, no, we are here and we deserve to be heard. Because it's definitely something that is not easy to talk about sometimes, and it's not something that is easy for our community to open up about, but it's so necessary that we are put into these discussions. I think when it comes to climate change spaces, we can fall into the trap of making it purely scientific instead of looking through a cultural lens, like Indigenous people tend to. And when that happens, it becomes a bit dehumanizing when we talk those who are climate victims, in the sense that we don't see them fully as human. We see them as stats. We see them as stories on a news article, on our news feeds, instead of actual people, families to a lot of NZ Kiwis who live here. Me, my family, my friends. And that is a really big issue, considering that New Zealand has the largest population of Pacific Islander people in the world. To not only our Pacific Islander population in New Zealand, but to who we are as one of the leading countries in the fight against climate change worldwide. It really does set a bar, I feel. And so when I think about the response, initially I think about the response from a lot of our Pacific Islander elders who would share with me their experiences of being on the islands and comparing what it's like now to when they were children. It's not only statistics, there's actual people who have gone back to the islands who have said that, when you go to the fish markets, there are less and less produce. There's more and more pollution. The coral reefs, when you swim around the islands, it's dying, and it's very real, and it's very scary for our elders to be able to say that to us in this generation. And so I feel like that's just more incentive for me and for 40K to keep going. And so when I think about all the negative pushback of people who think that climate change is real, who thinks that we're hallucinating about our people dying from natural causes, like we just make that up, I think it's really ridiculous. And again, it's more encouragement to actually keep going because our cultures are worth the fight. So that's definitely where I'm at when it comes to pushback and opening up space. Yeah.
Kia ora. And I think that there's also something to be said, and we'll get onto this later, around how art activism is really important for helping people to see things from a different perspective. But, both Alvisa and Fili have spoken about the challenges that we face, and particularly how they find strength to communicate the solutions to people. And Gina, your whole kind of kaupapa is very much focused on this is exactly what we need. We need to reduce the voting age in order to have greater input from younger people, from rangatahi in particular, in our political system. The greatest concern or kind of pushback that I hear, particularly from older folks on that one, is, the younger people these days, they're all apathetic. And I have a lot of reckons and hot takes on that. But what would you say to people who kind of put that out there?
Yeah, no, there's a lot of things that the older generations believe about young people, but young people are not one homogenous group, right? We all have such diverse and different beliefs, and we have all different backgrounds. We're all intersectional, and so when people say, "Oh, young people are just going to vote like their parents," or "Young people are all going to vote for this particular party," if you actually talk to some young people, they're probably not. And even in one friend group, they're not all going to be from the same political beliefs. Some of them are going to be maybe more engaged than others. And particularly on that whole people just vote like their parents thing. There have been other countries in the world which have lowered their voting age. So places like Scotland, Austria, Wales just did it recently. And because they've already lowered their voting age, they've been able to do research about that. And so for the Scottish referendum, when they had lowered their voting age for that. And then they just did a survey about whether or not children were going to vote in the same way as their parents. And I think it was about 52, 57% said that they would. And that's so close to it literally just being by chance, right? And so it's not just my parent votes in this way, they're a member of this political party, they're going to do that. You know, there's so many different reasons why someone's going to vote a certain way. And lowering the voting age gives them that opportunity to find out about different political parties, or even just like groups in general. Not everyone has to be part of a party, of course. They can just be interested in a certain issue. And that kind of, we see that lowering of the voting age is the first step to get people to vote, to get people engaged in democracy, because democracy is so important. And then when they vote that first time in that first election, where they're probably going to be in their local community, they're going to, you know, really know the area around them. And they're going to continue voting for the rest of their life because they've learned how to do it. They've started that habit, and then fingers crossed they'll continue on forever. So yeah.
That's awesome. Thank you, Gina. That actually, on the issues of apathy and democratic engagement, actually prompts for me something that I was having a conversation with somebody about at, we had our Auckland Central party office opening for the Greens last night. And there was somebody who was talking about younger people being apathetic. And I kind of responded to them because people somehow saw like just this one young candidate was going to change everything. And I always have to kind of try and grapple with that because as you say, younger people are not homogenous. They're not all the same. There is a diversity of perspectives. And obviously, even as we see here, folks come from different areas all around the country and from different migrant backgrounds, have different religious beliefs, have different ethnicities, all of these kind of intersectional parts of their identity. And that's not even to take into account things like gender identity or all of the other massive things that make up who a person is and who their community may be. But, you know, in response to this person in this very off-the-cuff yarn, I just kind of had to have them question whether it was that young people are truly apathetic or whether they'd actually talked to a younger person recently. Because what I find when I talk to young people is they care about a heck of a lot of stuff. They just don't necessarily believe that the systems and structures that exist right now that are so adversarial, that are so colonial, that are so one way of looking at the world, so myopic, that they can't necessarily deliver on the change that young people these days believe in. And that is why I think we're seeing this massive uprising of younger people heading to the streets. But that intersects with actually what Fili was saying around inequality. And around the fact that I think there are also a huge number of people who right now, and this is something Marama talked about when she did a speech at one of the hui we held recently, that it is really difficult to even contemplate something like voting or engaging in the democratic system, which sounds so like kind of intellectual and academic to begin with. If you're struggling to put kai on the table for your whānau, it is really hard to think about changing the system when your day-to-day is strife. So this is where I'm really stoked on one of the many policies that we've put out here for this election is the Poverty Action Plan. And this says, hey, we also firstly really want to recognise something, which is a lot of the rhetoric around things like child poverty. And it's really funny talking to mates of mine who operate in the NGO space, because when we talk about child poverty, we're actually talking about family poverty. We just happen to like to frame it in a certain way so that we can go, oh, this person's not to blame for being poor. But we still have such a deeply entrenched way of looking at the world that justifies inequality. And I think that this Poverty Action Plan, which ensures that nobody in this country, if you're talking about things like fundamental human rights, Gina, can fall below what we say is the bottom amount of money that is necessary to survive in Aotearoa New Zealand right now, which is $325 per week. So we create that available for students, for folks working part-time, for those who may not be able to find work at the moment. And then there's top-ups for people, whether they are single parents, whether they have disabilities, or a raft of other potential kind of top-ups to their inability to engage in employment or educational training or whatever the barriers are that they face whilst we work on changing those systems. So when we talk about something like that and actually alleviating some of those challenges and barriers that people face with regard to income, I mean, do you guys have any views on how that income inequality and removing that barrier of poverty for people to engage in the education system or in even kōrero like this or in democracy? I mean, how would that change things as far as you're concerned? Maybe I'll go Fili and then to Alvisa and then to Gina, and we'll then reverse it next time. So over to you, Fili.
It would change so much. As someone who comes from a Desau school, who's always lived, I would say below what is seen as a middle class income, it would change everything, I feel. One of the biggest struggles for me coming back to school was watching my friends have to adapt to a world post-COVID, where they have to, before we were always used to people working, we're always used to, our friends picking up jobs, but it's like more than ever, we've had to watch the shift between what we thought was going to be this great last year of our high school lives that we were going to enjoy to actually us being forced to grow up earlier to be able to provide for our families. And so I feel like a plan like this put in place will not only help them in a tangible way, but also within their mental health. Like I talked about before, uplifting marginalized communities is suicide prevention, and I feel like that isn't talked about enough. The mental challenges that come from living in less impoverished communities are so deep, and there's so many layers to it. It's exactly like you said, it's hard for us to imagine a future for ourselves when we can't even imagine, a week from now. I have friends who you have to like plan the way that they move throughout the world every single day so that they're able to provide for their younger siblings. I have friends who have to go and drop out of school to be able to pick up multiple jobs. And that's very real realities that people don't talk about when we talk about child poverty. They see it as just, like I said before, stats and infographics and news articles, not like it's actual people out on the streets, out in our homes, in our communities that we know. So I feel like this plan in action would not only help our generations, but would help our future generations. It would start an intergenerational a cycle of healing, which I feel like is so necessary after, especially for Pacific and Māori Indigenous communities, which were put through so much strife throughout colonization and throughout colonial structures. The healing that needs to take place can be found in this plan, which I feel like is so exciting and so monumental. So I definitely feel like it would have such a massive impact.
Oh, myself, I was just gonna say kapai, and honestly, you just gave me like something which I've been trying to articulate forever, is how we have this inextricable link between people's economic status and their ability to provide not only for themselves, but for their whānau and for their community, and their ability therefore to then feel a sense of belonging and do those other things that are necessary in order to survive and get that sense of well-being. You put it so eloquently that I wrote it down, that uplifting marginalized communities is suicide prevention. So yeah, thank you for that. That is amazing. Alvisa, what do you think in terms of inequality and poverty and removing those barriers would have impacts, particularly on younger people, but also our ability to engage in democracy and change things?
Yeah, so you mentioned earlier about my volunteering, and like being able to volunteer in the first place is such a privilege, because I have the time. I don't have to, I'm not struggling enough to have to, well, for starters, I don't have children, which really helps my current situation. It allowed me to stand for council, having that much, I kind of made the most of what I had. I went through a lot of rejections with trying to find a full-time job, which is a lot. It's very common nowadays, not just for young people, but for older people. People are starting to realize that as well. But participation in society is one of those things that really helps improve mental health. And if you can't do that, then you're focusing on survival, really. And if you're just surviving, it doesn't feel like you're living. And so that resonated with me, Fili, what you said about, supporting your family. A lot of people come here from other countries. I'm half Filipino. My mum's from the Philippines. Very similar situation over there. It's a nation of islands, closer together, but still similar issues. And that my family in the Philippines, I've got this like internal dilemma about where I am and how privileged I am in my position. And then there's people who actually are literally here just to let their families back home eat. And, parents move here, leaving their children behind in the islands, hoping to come to a better life. And then they get here and they realize it's not as great socially and financially as they thought it was, because it's really expensive living here in New Zealand. We are very lucky with, our standard living, standard quality of living, but that doesn't mean that everyone's in the same boat and everyone's as lucky as like myself. Where I was able to go to university, I was, I had a bit of experience to get a job while I was studying. And again, if I had that money when I was a student, my grades would probably be a lot better than they were. So there's a spectrum of people in different situations where people are struggling to the point of survival, and then there are people who are struggling just to sort of get their degree, and then there's more to that as well. So but the ability to participate in society, just having that little bit of extra freedom to go out and meet other people and be part of a community that's wider than your household and your children, I think that would have a huge impact on everybody's quality of living. Yeah.
And it's the space to imagine as well, eh? Like, it's the fact that when you are just surviving on a day-to-day, you feel like you're fighting, and that has a massive impact on your mental health in terms of wearing down who you are, what you're capable of. And I think this is one of the things that blows my mind the most, is in all of these narratives that so many people have bought into with awful terminology like beneficiaries and all of this other stuff, the beneficiary bashing culture, is just a lack of recognition of the fact that there are artists, innovators, creatives, entrepreneurs, incredible people who are intelligent and have so much to offer the world in all of these communities. And we're actually missing out on that when we suppress particularly these marginalized communities and their potential. Gina, what kind of difference would that make for you, for your whānau, or
I definitely totally agree what both of Elvisa and Fili said. Yeah, first of all, like being in New Zealand, I look back at my family in Vietnam and realize that I am so incredibly privileged to be a part of what I am and to have the things that I do have.
Given the number of youth voters who don't bother to vote, what is your plan to get them to vote? Do you have a concerted campaign to encourage voting, maybe working with universities to make it easier, or even high schools as well, to make it super easy and even cool to vote? Because it's one thing to lower the voting age, it's another thing to have people recognize their power.
Of course, yeah. Well, as an 16, we really want to see more civics education, right? If you don't really know how voting works or what voting is, or just the systems that we have in New Zealand, how are you going to be able to make an informed vote just because you don't know how it all works? And so definitely keen to see that. And not even just for young people, but for people of all ages as well. When you go out and chat with people, sometimes they're not 100% sure about what it all means. And so like I'm very privileged to understand and be a little bit of a nerd about all of the political things, but there are some people who don't. So we should, I'd really love to see more civics education for everyone. And yeah, I guess, yeah, if in terms of like lowering the voting age and ensuring that people will vote, 18 to 21 year olds are at their most transient, right? They're more likely to be away from home, more likely to be that struggling student trope kind of thing, who's got the time to be able to make that informed vote. And then they don't vote in that first election, and then they don't for the next one because they haven't started that habit. But then when you bring that voting age down, and you're able to get that person to vote when they're in an environment, like in a learning environment where they know and understand how to do it, they're going to vote in that first election, and then we can see that they will continue voting for the rest of their life because they know how to do it and have started that habit. Yeah.
And Alvisa, I know that you have something to add to this, but I also just wanted to chuck into the mix after that. Fili was talking about around self-actualization and around different ways of people politically engaging, and that may be just sharing their voice. And you haven't today talked about dancing, which is one of the other awesome things that you're involved and engaged in. So please share your kōrero with regard to lowering the voting age, or about people being engaged in voting democratically, but also those different methods of self-expression that are so critical to being part of something bigger than yourself.
Okay, so there's a few branches off that. Thanks. So just sort of touching on what Gina is doing, like as a movement, and with her campaign, you know, like we think about one of the main things that I think about when people try to sort of suppress 16-year-olds voting is they can I was one once upon a time, but when you're 16 and even 15, you can work and pay taxes, but you can't make a call, you can't vote for what those taxes are used for. So you're contributing to something that you don't have a voice on, you know. You can join the army at 17 and train up to fight for your country, and you can't vote yet. And you can drive on the roads that get paid by, you know, taxes. So yeah, all these points are really good points for those who want to make an argument against people who want to suppress the voting age being 16. There's a starting point. Now, the second point that I wanted to make was, if you haven't heard of Auckland Youth Voice or Youth Voice Canterbury, look them up, because they are education sort of platforms, groups that aim to educate youth on civics, governance and politics. And we're looking to start a branch here in Taranaki. Shout out to Chris if you're watching, he's helping me with that project, because, you know, I'm learning on the job. And not only am I in the governance space, but I work with youth. I teach breakdance. I'm involved in pop-up poetry Taranaki, where, you know, I heard Fili, I think we shared one of her piece over lockdown. And even that, those three young girls, Chlöe, you can fill me in, those three young girls who talked about Te Reo, that poem, and it just made me cry. Like, I was just like, wow, this needs to be viral, because it spoke I'm involved so in loud and so beautifully and elegantly. Where, could you just fill me in on what that group's name was, or who they were?
Fili?
Actually, the group is Ngahini Pukorero, so that would be Matariki Bennett, Manaya Tufare, and Arahia Ho. They're amazing wahine. Yeah.
Yeah, they're incredible.
Yeah, that was powerful. But it's just another example of how poetry and self-expression, the whole arts realm is so powerful in communicating ideas that grasp people's attention and make people think deeply and put them in a space outside of their own lives to really connect with other stories. So yeah, you're right. I teach breakdance for a local hip hop school, and we have a lot of young, diverse children who participate in that. And it's one of those things where it's the only way they can travel around New Zealand, and some of them fundraise to go over to Australia to represent not only Taranaki, but New Zealand as well. So yeah, arts is really important in allowing young people to participate in society. Yeah.
Kia ora, thank you so much. Just conscious we've only got 3 minutes left. I could have yarned with all of you all night. You're incredible. And I can see that flicking through on the chat as well. There's massive recognition for the mahi that all of you are doing in your respective communities, but also the kaupapa that you are carrying. The final question that I just have before we all go back into our respective evenings is one from somebody who's watching tonight, but we can perhaps riff off of it a bit as well. And the question is, what's the best way to motivate or inspire young people to take action and get involved? But I want to extrapolate on that, because we've been talking a lot about young people and how younger people get involved. But I also want to talk about perhaps the older folks who are in these younger people's lives and how they perhaps can pass the mic or elevate these younger people or back them. So we'll start with you, Gina. How do not only these younger people get involved, but how do the people around them support them to get involved?
Totally. I think, yeah, that's super important, right? I'd say for young people, don't be afraid to be the youngest person in the room. It sucks. Like, honestly, it kind of sucks. And then if you have, there's lots of different intersections of someone's identity, right? Being a young woman who also has a migrant background, that kind of is a little bit worse sometimes, but getting over that bit of fear and knowing that you're valid to be there and you're valid to be in that room with whatever organisation or event that you're at. You deserve to be there just as much as anyone else does. And then for the older people, pass the mic. If you've been speaking at all of these events for quite some time, maybe you don't need to continue speaking, check out some of the other organisations that exist in the same issues that you care about. There's definitely going to be young people out there who care about those issues too. And maybe it's time for them to be able to give that speech instead of you.
Kia ora. As a 26-year-old, I absolutely tautoko that I was the young one, and now I'm seeing all these 16 and 17-year-olds coming through, and they are far more eloquent and on the ball than I. Fili, what would you say?
I'll definitely tautoko what Gina had just said. Man, definitely it's about getting our youth to believe in themselves, and actually seeing yourself reflected in the politics can be a bit hard for those who don't have the knowledge accessible to them. So I feel like the responsibility of adults is to be able to open that up. I like to say that it's important to code switch between, political jargon and like making it, even just turning it into slang for the youth to understand. There's nothing wrong with that if the same message is there. And I feel that it's important for youth to be able to understand what's happening first and foremost, because I think a lot of what happens is that once we like decipher what it actually means, what these policies actually means, it becomes an uproar, because of course for marginalized communities we'll realize that it actually affects us disproportionately. And so I think it's important for you to be able to see that and to know that, exactly like everyone has said before, our votes matter, our voices matter, our opinions matter, our contribution to the country matters. And that is what I'd have to say on that matter. Yeah.
Kia ora. And I would say as well, I mean, one of the fascinating things around making policies and politics accessible to people, and this is the same with kind of inclusive design around cities and stuff too, is that you don't just improve it for younger people, you improve it for all people. Because I've been door knocking all across the country and of late around Auckland Central, and I can tell you for a fact that there are a lot of people who pretend that they know what they're talking about when they talk about politics. But the word the economy means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And as soon as you start getting into the weeds on that, even if you know how to talk the talk, you might not necessarily know what on earth it means. Alvisa, what would you say is the other aging member of this panel, you and myself both? I feel like we're the old ones in the room, eh?
No, to be fair, I do turn 30 in January, so I do feel a little bit that next generation above Gina and Fili. But the great thing is I feel a responsibility to help both ends, of those generations, across generations, to communicate the ideas and also help resource both ends. So for instance, I've been doing a lot of history and I recently found out how writing came about from Mesopotamia, and I found a book in our local research centre. Oh, Chloe, you'll really like this book, Anno Domini 2000. It's called, it was written by Sir Julius Vogel. Really great book, and I really wanted to get real popular because he was the Isaac Asimov of the late 1800s for New Zealand. He was the first science fiction writer. So look that book up. There's some amazing history that will really help you support your arguments for whatever movements or causes you want to fight for. So do your research so that you can make really good debates, and yeah, just keep talking and listening. Don't just talk, but listen also, so that you can really have a real conversation. I think for both ends, older generations and younger generations, just listen and have a real conversation and do your research.
Ka pai hoa. I mean, that is a fascinating note to end on, I think, particularly because we're both nerds, so thank you for that recommendation, Alvisa. But the fact, too, that you can learn so much from those different perspectives, and I think particularly as it's matariki, reflecting on particularly Indigenous knowledge and how that was the start of exploration of the stars, and how we have a tendency to overwrite that with things that we see as supposedly scientific because they have come from certain ways of understanding the world or certain terminologies that have more accessibility within academic realms or otherwise. They're more legitimate or more valid. And I saw that somebody as well, just in summary, popped in the chat earlier around the notion of life experience. And this is something which I have a particular experience with, being told actually when I was running for the Auckland Mayoralty when I was 22 years old, just because I was real grumpy at the way things were, and I just felt we had to take the protest to the streets and actually to show up that younger people were not to be taken for granted, but also my community wasn't to be taken for granted, and there was solutions for this stuff that politicians were pretending there wasn't if there was the willpower. And I was told by certain people, one person even went so far as to say that my brain wasn't fully developed. My brain fully develops when I'm 25 years old. So I did my research as Alvisa recommended, and I found out that your brain may not be fully developed until you're 25, but it starts degenerating at the age of around 40. So as far as I was concerned, I was on the way out, and that was my response. But you have to deal with this stuff with good humor, but also recognize that when you are the minority in certain spaces, whether that is your age or your skin color or your ethnicity or the way that you sound or the English isn't necessarily your first language or otherwise, that unfortunately right now the status quo is such that there is a certain semblance of people who may push back on that and ask you to validate and legitimize yourself in that space in a way that other people who look and sound the part don't have to. And that's where I've always found it far more important to recognize that you are not an individual, but you are part of something bigger than just yourself. Because that is what resilience is. Resilience isn't an individual trait. It isn't a commodity that you buy off of the shelf. It is, in fact, a community that you can fall back on when you need to, and something that you can engage in and find the space for others to stand up when you need to take a bit of a breather. And I'd just say finally, I find all of you guys incredibly inspirational. So thank you so much for coming and for participating in this tonight. And thank you as well to everybody who has been watching this from home or from wherever you happen to be. But the idea of inspiration, I think, is something that is really deserving of challenging in the 21st century, because often we talk about inspiration as though it's something that happens over there. We kind of individualize and we celebritize the idea of inspiration as something that other people do. But inspiration is actually just a mirror. Inspiration is seeing in somebody else something that you admire about yourself. So where you see that inspiration, recognize that you own that potential and own it. And find your people, find your kaupapa and go hard. You won't always get it right, but if you do your research and you have that humility and you stay humble, then you'll continue to move forwards. So kapai, and thank you so much to Fili, to Alvisa, to Gina, to everybody who tuned in, to the amazing green team behind the scenes here. Have a lovely night. If you want to sign up to the Poverty Action Plan, I believe that there's been some links put in all of the respective chats. I also want to state that the amazing spoken word group of the Three Wahine that Alvisa was referring to as Ngahine Pukorero, who are incredible, and you can just Google them and find all of the awesome mahi that they've been doing on Instagram or Facebook or whatever. But thanks again, e hoa ma. Have a lovely evening, and yeah, ka pai. Hope this has left you with some inspiration, which means that you can do it too. Kia ora. See you later.